God made the sun, and it gives. God made the moon, and it gives. God made the stars, and they give. God made the air, it gives. God made the clouds, they give. God made the earth, it gives. God made the sea, it gives. God made the trees, they give. God makes the flowers, they give. God made the birds, they give. God made the beasts, they give. God made the plants, they give. God made man, he doesn't always give. In fact, when it comes to giving in the evangelical church, some people stop at nothing. So it took a while, didn't it? Took a while. So what I want to do is I want to just focus on one simple verse in this most famous of all messages preached, the Sermon on the Plain, Sermon on the Mount, from Jesus Christ, found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verse 38. And it's focusing on developing a generous spirit. I'm going to read the verse once. We started it last week. This isn't to be continued. And then what I want to do is I want to kind of finish my thoughts on this. So let me read it, and then I'm going to ask you to read it with me, okay? These are the words of Jesus Christ. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Would you read these words with me, please? Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And quite frankly, if you look at the context, this is a love your enemies message here. Jesus is not just talking about financial generosity. Jesus is talking about a generous spirit that bleeds across a lot of boundaries into the thoughts that we have towards people, our attitudes towards others, our quickness or willingness to forgive, the words we choose to use or not use, our time investments, the way we give our talents away, our material possessions, our money. But this morning what I want to do is I want to focus in on this latter aspect of the generous spirit. I'm going to talk about the way we view and the way we use financial resources. And quite frankly, if you scrutinize the Gospels, you will see that about 10% of Jesus' focus on his teaching had to do with the way we view and the way we use financial resources. So quite frankly, though maybe many churches will kind of cower away from this theme, I think we need to deal with it head on and just talk about it out in the open. Last week, I left you off with a principle that I would like to unpack this morning. God essentially owns everything that flows through our life. So let's remember, we're not really owners of anything. We're borrowers, right? We're managers, administrators, or stewards. And I had said at the end of my message last week that stewardship, biblical stewardship, what Jesus calls us to, is organizing life in such a way, our life, your life in such a way, that God can spend it. Because we're not ultimately the owners of anything. Even our breath will be withdrawn from us and taken back to God. And so last week we began to talk about the enemies that would eat away from this development of a generous spirit. By the way, God is generous. He just wants his kids to be like him. So he wants us to be generous, okay? But there are enemies that fight against us becoming generous people. And I had mentioned 4 last week. I'm going to throw another one in this morning. They are greed, which is also called idolatry. When we're fixated on financial resources, or a false sense of security that we gain from financial resources, selfishness, fear, I think, is a big factor that holds us back. But there was one of them that I didn't mention last week, and I want to throw it in. I didn't say it last week because it's a 4-letter word, and you're not supposed to use this in church, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyways. It's debt. It's the demon of debt, and it's very real, and it's very common in America, even in the church. And I want you to watch this video clip and we'll talk about it, okay? kind of makes you break out in a cold sweat, doesn't it? It's interesting that we're kind of not allowed to talk about the financial condition of people. But how could we not talk about it in church if we really want to be free? If the Son sets you free, you're free indeed. So I just want you to know something. Whether you give a nickel to this church or not, it is the prayer of our church leadership that you would know and discover and live in financial freedom, because this is a vital area in your life. So rather than pointing fingers, I want to offer you hope. There's hundreds of families that are part of Creekside that have gone through what we call Financial Peace University. It's a Dave Ramsey ministry that helps people get back on track with the way that they administer or manage or steward their finances. We have another course that's starting on the 29th of August. I realize that's still a few months away, but you can call and sign up for that. We also have families that have struggled and come out the backside victorious in this area that are willing to meet with other families here if you want some coaching. So I just want you to know there's hope here at Creekside, and we really want you to be able to beat the demon of debt, because quite frankly, if you don't, you can't practice anything that I'm going to talk about this morning. You're kind of trapped. And the wisest person that ever lived was a king that lived 3,000 years ago, and his name was Solomon, and he truly said, and it was just as true when the ink was drying 3,000 years ago as it is today, that the borrower is slave to the lender. And we don't want you to be a slave to anybody or anything except the Lord Jesus Christ. So that is our hope for you. And why do we say that? Because if we are going to be like God, God is a generous spirit. He calls us to be generous spirits as well. The same king that said that the borrower is slave to the lender also said these words in Proverbs chapter 3. He said, honor God with your wealth. Notice also with the first fruits of all your crops. And when you do that, then your barns will be filled to overflowing and your vats will brim over with new wine. Okay, 3,000 years ago, it was an agricultural society and wealth was measured in crops and herds. So he speaks in terms of giving God the first part of your crop, the first part of your herd. Today, income is not essentially measured by crops and herds. We measure it in other ways. But the principle is the same. Honor God with your source of income, with the first part of it, with the part off the top. That's why when my wife and I receive a salary, we immediately give an electronic transfer to the church where we give to God off the top, because we've learned the hard way that if you wait till the end of the week and you give God what's left over, it ain't much. And it doesn't honor God either. It's sort of God will just figure out what we need and we'll give you whatever we don't need. And boy, there's a lot of ways that we can move wants into the need category, huh? So we're to honor God with our wealth. And you can't do that if you let the demon of debt or selfishness or fear or this false sense of security or greed eat away at the very foundations of that generous spirit that God is calling us to. Remember, biblical stewardship is organizing your life in such a way that God can spend it. So here's what I want to do. I want to pick a really cool illustration from the Gospel of Luke. It's a story of a person that demonstrated a ridiculously, recklessly generous spirit. It's pre-church. And then what I want to do is I want to take the applications from this illustration and bleed them into the life of a person that's playing an active role in the greatest thing that Jesus Christ is doing on earth today, which is building his church. I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So what does it look like today to have a generous spirit as I'm a responsible member of the church that Jesus Christ is building on earth today? That's kind of the way I want to do it. And the hero that I picked is not one that you would normally think as you think about stewardship. You'd usually think of a rich king or some rich individual, but this is actually a widow. And she's very poor, and we don't know her name. We don't know if she had dependent children she was caring for. We don't know much about her, but she is lifted up by Jesus Christ as the greatest illustration of the generous spirit in the scriptures. And since she's a woman, we're going to call her a shero this morning, okay? I don't like heroin because that sounds like drugs, so she's a shero, okay? She's a shero, all right? And you find her story in Luke, if you flash forward in the Gospel of Luke to chapter 21. So I'll read the first 4 verses of chapter 21 of Luke if you want to turn there, okay? Luke 21, verses 1 through 4. As he looked up, Jesus saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor woman put 2 very small copper coins in. I tell you the truth, he said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in all she had to live on. Now, this same story is told in the Gospel of Mark chapter 12, but with more details. So if you want to flip over to Mark chapter 12, I'm going to read from chapter 12, verse 41 through verse 44, okay? Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. He's kind of spying on the givers. And many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor woman came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a fraction of a penny. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, and he says a solemn oath here, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. So let's take a magic carpet ride. 2,000 years back in time, we're in Jerusalem. We're in the temple courts precincts by the women's court, and it's near the Gate Beautiful, and we're looking against this wall, and there are 13 big receptacles. They're called shaforoth. They're like trumpet mouth open wide receptacles that people would come, and as they worship God, they put in their monetary gifts. No paper money back then. You can hear the jingle all day long. And there's 13 of them, and each of them have a different Hebrew letter on them that represent the designated giving that people are. Some are dedicated to the maintenance of the temple precincts because there's a lot of traffic there. There's a lot of wear and tear, and they got to fix it up. There's other receptacle for the income of the priest because they were completely dependent. They were like the pastors of the day, working full time, and the people would give to their maintenance and their sustenance. There were people that gave offerings for the morning and evening offerings that were offered to God. For the water, for the wood, for all kinds of things going on at the temple, people gave as a regular practice. In fact, the Old Testament gives a command to all of Israel, which was a worshiping community in Exodus, saying, no one is to appear before me empty-handed. Everybody came and brought God a gift. And you're going, well, why? Well, I'll get to that. But everybody brought a gift. So whether it was a sacrifice, whether it was a free will offering, whether it was a monetary gift of gratitude to God, whatever it was, nobody in Jesus' day showed up at the temple offering God nothing. And why? Because God is generous and he wants to teach us generosity. So he asks this of people as they approach him. This is new to some people today. They think, you don't have to do that anymore, right? We'll get to that. And she puts in, we talk Old Testament, they called it a tithe when they would give 10%. Did she tithe? No. What about an offering? Did she give an offering? Not really, because a tithe is when you give 10% of your income to God. An offering is when you give something above 10% to your God, which let's say 5% over a tithe, you give 15%. That's still not what she gave, because she gave everything. All she had to live on. She cast herself into the arms of an invisible God, saying, catch me, please. I'm falling on your mercy and your generosity. And so what I want to do is I want to just kind of talk about lessons about giving God's way through the illustration of this shiro of the generosity, spirit, faith, okay? Lessons about giving. And the first lesson, I kind of already said it, but since we're filling in blanks, let's go ahead and say giving has always been an essential part of worship. Giving has always, from the very beginning, even Cain and Abel, folks, giving has always been an essential part of worship. And some people say, well, that's kind of superficial because God doesn't get hungry. God doesn't need our money. So why are we bothering with this? There are multiple reasons why God commands people that worship him to be generous people. Maybe this seems a little elementary, but in Jesus' day, people gave to God by giving through the priesthood at the temple in Jerusalem. That's how people gave to God. And there were 3 primary reasons for which people gave. Okay? The first was the maintenance of the worship facilities. The second was the maintenance of the priesthood, because the priests had no other job. This was their job. And the third was to maintain also an elaborate system where they would help people that were poor. Okay? And incidentally, the Bible teaches us in the Old Testament that people gave a tenth of their income as a regular tithe, and every 3 years they gave another tithe for the maintenance of the poor. And that's found in Leviticus chapter 27, verses 30 through 32. So people gave as a baseline of giving to God about 13 1/3%, okay? And it actually goes up from there, but we'll start with that right now, okay? Now, these practices did not essentially change with the birth of the church. The church eventually became predominantly Gentile, but it started Jewish. But there are 4 purposes for which Christians give today, okay? There's an added one that wasn't part of Judaism. We actually give towards the maintenance and development of worship facilities. This church didn't just happen here, right? The buildings. We also give for the maintenance of people that are in ministry, either full or part-time, so they can commit their time to developing the kind of ministries that help our families grow. We also give to the poor. We have a helps fund that gives to the poor, but there's a 4th reason that wasn't part of Judaism. God has called the Church of Jesus Christ to take the gospel to the whole world. So we are invested in local and global outreach to accomplish the Great Commission of Jesus Christ. There are 4 purposes for which we give, okay? Primarily. And those are your 4. And the Bible also teaches, if you go into the latter chapters of 2 Corinthians, the Bible is very clear that our primary source of giving is to be to the church, but it's really to God, and it's really through the church that we give, okay? And I can make a good case for that, but I want to come back to this. Why would God ask worshipers to make giving an essential part of their worship? But I'm going to give you 3 reasons. There's more, I'm just going to give you 3. I don't want to confuse you. Reason A, for the good that such gifts can accomplish. This seems kind of crazy, but have you ever thought that you can actually make a temporal exchange of paper and metal and electronic transfers called giving money that can actually change the eternal trajectory of other people's lives? In other words, you can gain something eternal by surrendering something you can't keep in the long haul anyways. That's a pretty good exchange, isn't it? Here, I'll give you an illustration. Just this year alone, our fiscal year is closing in the next few weeks, okay? And we've posted our budget. It's out in the atrium area. We want you to know about this. This year, we will have given more than $600,000 to local and global outreach to get the gospel out beyond Elk Grove, okay? And that is just from the official church budget. That does not count individual giving. That puts it over $1 million. I just want you to know we're committed to these kind of things. Here's another one that's interesting. We give to develop ministry opportunities. How many college students do we have with us? Do we have some college people over here? Okay. Yes, shout out for college. Here's the thing I like about college students. They're beautiful people, but they're also poor. Yeah, okay? All right. I know, because I was one time. And then I got a job. Okay, I'm just kidding. I had to graduate first and get married and let my wife take care of me for a few years. Okay. But here's something very cool. Did you know, because of financial resources we give as a church, we are able to structure and commit certain resources to a college ministry. They recently had a barbecue with 100 college students. That's the largest college gathering in the history of Creekside Christian Church. Praise God for that. You know why? Because college people matter to God. And so we need to give to things so that we can cause things to grow. We give because of the good that can come out of the giving that we give, right? The second reason God calls us to give is because it tests and it strengthens our faith. Because it is a big dog test, right? Well, money or God, right? We're told in Malachi, it's actually an Italian prophet called Malachi. Some people call him Malachi. In Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, listen to the words of God. He's telling you that he wants you to test and strengthen your faith by giving. This is what he says. He says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this. He's basically saying, come on, let's see who can outgive, you or me. Come on, let's try this. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have room enough for it. Some people read this verse and they think these verses and they say, so you buy your blessing. That is not what God is saying here. What God is saying is you are never going to be more generous than me. So why don't you trust me in this vital area of your life that I can take care of you even if the math doesn't make sense. Because here's one thing that was really hard for me to learn as a new Christian. That if I gave God a tithe, that meant I would live on 90% instead of 100%. I would swell up and die. Well, guess what? I swole up, but I didn't die, right? Right? And I got to tell you, I live better on 90% with God's blessing than I did on 100% keeping it all to myself. Go figure. That's God math. And it factors in blessing too. But let me give you a third reason why God calls worshipers to give. And it's similar to the second, but it is slightly different. It's that the reason number C here is the good that such giving does to the character of the giver. To the character of the giver. I mean, there are multiple passages in the scriptures that speak of how if you hold back from giving to God, you actually rob from him. But think about the good that happens inside your heart when you actually give. Not just the strengthening of your faith, but you don't get attached to money. The love of money is not going to run your life. The love of money is not going to ruin your life. And by the way, you know how you deal with a greedy spirit? Give a generous gift of money away. You become what you repeatedly do. If you're repeatedly generous in your giving, you become a generous person, right? I think that's what God is driving at. Biblical stewardship is organizing your life in such a way that God can spend it. It is his life anyways. You're just doing it as a faith journey. Now back to the story. We're sitting under the colonnades there at the temple near the gate beautiful, and in the distance we're watching people that are giving various kinds of gifts to God. And the first thing you observe is just a little shocking because we don't do it here at Creekside. Giving was very public and visible. Okay? I mean, everybody saw what everybody else was giving. I remember one time I did this pulpit exchange with an African-American preacher. And he came and he spoke in the church where I pastored. And I went and I preached in the place where he pastored. And I thought I was getting the better deal because he had to do 3 services. I only had to do 1 service. Problem was his 1 service was 5 hours long. And so I lost that day because it was a service, man. But in the middle of the service, they did the offering. And I thought, oh, where's the bags? Oh, no bags. Here's the table. Everybody march forward and put your money on the table in front of everyone else. And I thought, what? They not only did that, they had them all march there with songs and music and gloves. Put it all there on the table. They gathered it all up. We sang a couple songs. They counted it. Came back and said there wasn't enough. We're doing another offering. No category. Close that window. Okay, we're not going to do that this morning. But I thought, wow. Maybe our church has got something to learn on this one. Jesus' day, it was highly public. And it was very noisy too. All metal money rolling down the throats of these big trumpet receptacles. You know, kind of like Las Vegas, only different. Just the noises, right? Just going down into the throats of those giving devices. And what's going on is that Mark tells us Jesus was across the way, kind of unobserved, spying on people as they were giving their money. You know, oh, God will close his eyes. He just won't know. Oh, are you kidding? He knows. That leads to lesson number 2 of giving God's way. All right? The Lord carefully observes us as we give. The Lord carefully observes us as we give. Some people had large holdings. They gave large sums of money that day. There was nothing wrong with that. This was the Passover season, and wealthy worshipers were very numerous, and they gave very liberally. Mark 12:41 says very graphically, many rich people threw in large amounts. I got to tell you guys, do you remember the church shootings about a year ago in Texas, maybe not quite a year ago? There was a family in our church that stepped forward and said, the security measures of this church are not sufficient, and they funded the addition of 44 additional security cameras that just came online this week so that you and I would be secure as we worship the Lord on Sunday mornings. They just funded the whole thing. Okay, now don't clap. because I want to tell you another story now. There was also this little girl named Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, when my wife and I were missionaries, we went to their home and we explained the work of God that we were doing in Italy. And Elizabeth had been saving up money to buy a camera. I think her goal was like $25. Yes, cameras cost $25 back then. That was when the sky was still clean. And after she heard the work of God, about the work of God in Italy, she went into her room and she brought her piggy bank out and she emptied it on the table. She had almost all the money she needed for the camera. She said, I want you to take this to Italy and spend it on the work of God for me. And I got to tell you, both gifts that I just described, there's a man who lost his wife to death during a capital campaign that actually marched forward and put her wedding ring on the altar and said, I want you to use this to further the purposes of God on earth. You got to understand, whether you give online, whether you give in offering bags, whether you come into the office, as you give to God through Creekside, however you're giving, Jesus sees it and takes notice. It hits his radar screen, be it much, be it little. And I think that what's important is that as you looked at what this gal actually gave, it seemed, humanly speaking, totally insignificant. And yet Jesus was so impressed with what she gave because he understood what was behind it. It was most likely the smallest monetary gift of the day, and people were probably trying to push her out of the way so they could give much larger sums of money. But it leads to lesson number 3 of giving God's way. The Lord does not focus on the amount given, but on the heart of the giver. The Lord does not focus on the amount given, but on the heart of the giver, the heart. I'll say it right. This gal's a flower in the wilderness. This is pure worship because the focus was not on portion, but proportion. Do you understand the difference? I'm a math geek, so excuse me. You got one family that makes $100,000 a year and they give $10,000. That's a tithe. You have another family that makes $10,000 and they give $10,000. It's the same portion. It's a totally different proportion. In the first case, it's 10% kept, 90% kept, 10% given. In the second case, it's 100% given. And frankly, I don't know how this lady did it. What's she going to live on? If she's like me, she'd at least think maybe I should keep one of them. But she gave them both. And as a result, she stands out on the canvas of human history all by herself as the Shiro of generous spirit giving. I want you to know that the text actually says in both Luke and in Mark that she gave 2 lepton coins, which literally means 2 thin ones, okay? Because they are dinky little coins. Now, for those of you that are experts in American money, I want to take you on a journey into Bible money, okay? Because I actually learned some stuff about this. I lived in the Roman Empire for 18 years, or at least Italy, where the Roman Empire used to be. So let me just show you. This is what money looked like in Jesus' time. The most valuable coin in Jesus' time was called an aureus. It's about the size of a dime, weighed 3 times the amount of a dime. It was worth 25 days' wages for a normal wage earner, about a month's salary. And people had these coins. And then there was some regional colonial coins minted in very significant cities like Antioch or Tyre or Phoenicia. They were called tetradrachm. They were about this big. They were over 4 times the weight of a denarius, but they were silver, and they'd be worth roughly 4 days' wages. The Roman Empire also minted what was called a denarius, and this was a very common coin mentioned many times in the Bible, a day's wages for a denarius, or a half a day's wage for a quinarius, which was half a denarius, okay? And then the Romans minted bronze coins as well, which were of lesser value. They'd be like quarters on a dollar, okay? They had a sestertius about this big, and you'd take 4 of those to make 1 denarius. Or they'd have a dupondius. It would take 8 of those to make a denarius. Or an osarion, which would take 60. This is mentioned, this coin, in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It took 16 of those to make 1 denarius. And then there was a quadrans, which would take about 64 of those to make a denarius. So it's like pennies on the dollar, okay? And then the Roman Empire said, stop. We don't want to make any more small change. We're tired. So we'll just let the provinces make the little peanut coins, okay? The coins for like buying eggs and milk and flour. we'll let the local provinces do that. And in Jesus' day, there were many coins circulating that were local coins minted by the Maccabees or Herod the Great or Herod Archelaus, Pontius Pilate, that were in circulation. And those were worth, it took about 192 of those to make one denarius. And for a brief period of time, they minted even a smaller coin called a lepton, okay? And that was about half of a pruta, and it would take 384 of those to make up a denarius. They were the dinky, little, skinny, flat ones. They were smaller than a penny, okay? And this is what this lady gave. By the way, I'm just curious. Was anybody born on February 29th that's present? Born on a leap year? Anybody here that was born on February 29th on a leap year? Anybody? Is there anybody's birthday today? It's your birthday today, and you can prove it. We'll cut you open. We'll count your rings. I don't know how we'll do it, but it's your birthday today. Where's the birthday? Come here, come here, come here. Yeah, come here. Yeah, you. It's your birthday. I have a widow's mite, a real live widow's mite I want to give you. I won't ask you your age. That would be totally rude. That's a 2,100-year-old coin. Okay? Careful, it blows up tonight at 8 o'clock. Okay. All right. It pays to sit up close to front. Literally, it pays. Okay, are you with me now? Now you're paying attention, yeah. Yeah, because we will be giving out cars next week. Next point in giving God's way, okay? Next lesson is that real giving requires faith. This gal falls on God and gives everything. She trusts God. This is raw, undiluted faith. The gospel calls us to surrender to God in total trust. What better illustration than a lady that gives everything she has to God? You know, we either believe God's promise that he'll take care of his kids or we don't. And if you don't, you can't please God because only faith pleases God. Remember, we have promises in the Bible like Philippians 4:19 that says, my God will meet all your needs. Now, don't read what it doesn't say. It doesn't say, my God will meet all your wants and whims. My God will meet all your needs according to his glorious riches in Christ Jesus. God takes care of his kids, and this woman actually believed God would do it. And so she put him to the test. How difficult a lesson that must have been for the disciples to learn as Jesus said, guys, come here, get over here, watch what she's doing. And they probably were yawning, thinking no big deal. He said, oh, you're missing the whole point. He says, I solemnly swear to you, this poor widow dropped more into the treasury than all the others because it was a faith gift that represented total abandonment to God. Those two little coins must have looked like sparkling diamonds to Jesus Christ. Lesson number 5 is similar to lesson number 4. Real giving must be sacrificial. Real giving must be sacrificial. Why didn't she keep one of the coins to herself? It still would have been a 50% gift. Real giving must be sacrificial. What is this lady going to live on? What's she going to eat? Air? Jesus says here, well, let me define sacrifice for you, because if we say real giving must be sacrificial, let's be clear. Sacrifice is the act of giving up something that is greatly valued. And in this case, it was her money. Sacrifice is the act of giving up something that is greatly valued, because if you give something away, it means you can't spend it on something else. And often when you're giving things away, you're voting against yourself and indulging things that you want yourself. So there's a real faith test involved there, right? Sacrifice is the act of giving up something that is greatly valued. And in God's book, this lady sacrificed because the text tells us repeatedly, it says, this widow put in more than all the others because these people gave out of their wealth, but she gave out of her poverty all she had to live on. So, and this is so true. I'm an American. I'm a wealthy man. When I give, I dip into the pool of wealth and draw out something to give. She dipped into an empty pool of poverty and gave everything she had. It's different. Real giving must be sacrificial. You need to feel it. There's very few things in the gospel that amaze Jesus Christ. This woman amazed Jesus Christ. I remember there's a story in the Old Testament of how David, I can't get into all the details, but it was a plague that happened because of a sin of David. The death angel was killing off some Israelites. He halted over this field called Araunah's Field, which would eventually become the place where Solomon's temple would be built. David went there and he said, I got to buy your field. I got to make an offering to God. Araunah says, you can just have it. I'll sign the grant deed. I'll give it to you. He says, absolutely not. And these are the words David speaks to him at that time. He says, I will not take for the Lord what is yours, or sacrifice a burnt offering that costs me nothing. In other words, if I don't feel it, it has no value. Real faith has to be sacrificial. You got to feel it. I remember talking with one couple that supported us as missionaries, and I said, I don't want to embarrass you, and I know you don't want me keeping record, but you have surrendered thousands and thousands of dollars to the ministry. Tell me, what drives you to do that? They just said, we just believe that God meant it when he said, store up for treasures in heaven. And we want to send it on ahead. And we want to give until we feel it. In fact, they actually said, we actually now have a challenge that we want to give until we stop feeling it. I said, tell me what that feels like when you get there, buddy. I've never been there. Sacrifice. By human calculations, what she did was totally insignificant, but by divine standards, it was a huge sacrifice. And because God's not calling us to do equal giving, he's calling us to equal sacrifice. You understand that we don't all have the same income earning potential here, right? And so it's ludicrous to say everybody should give the same amount because we earn different amounts. So God is talking about not equal giving, but equal sacrifice. I've seen people give diamonds to the church, precious metals to the church, cars to the church, property to the church, houses to the church, stocks to the church, bonds to the church. I've seen amazing generosity that just shocks me. I've been your pastor since 1901. Yeah, no. I've been your pastor. I use a very special cream and it keeps... I've been here since 2014, and I got to say, I am humbled by the incredible generosity of this church. So I can stand before you this morning, not trying to trick you into a big offering this morning, because we're trying to be good with money here. We're trying to do, as a church, what we want you to do as individuals. But I'm just amazed at how God stirs the generosity of his people to accomplish great things together. But don't forget, most of us give out of our wealth. And this woman gave out of her poverty everything. Which leads to my final lesson on giving God's way, that real giving has a certain recklessness to it. I'm sorry if I keep coming back to this, but why didn't she keep one of the coins? Why did she give them both? Come on. Did she have dependent children that needed to eat? I don't know. There's another story of a woman in Mark chapter 14. Jesus was on his way to the cross. Everybody was focused on themselves, and Jesus was having dinner at a guy's house named Simon the leper that had been healed. And this woman goes into her bedroom, and she retrieves an alabaster bottle of spikenard perfume. Very expensive. It would have cost a year's salary to buy this spikenard perfume, okay? 1 full year for a little perfume, okay? A little dab will do you, right? And she brings it out to Jesus and breaks the neck of this alabaster. It's like a glass container. And she proceeds to spill it over his head. And it's dripping off his hair onto his tunic and pouring down his Bible while the disciples are screaming, she has done a foolish thing, and they rebuke her sternly for it. And Jesus says, knock it off, guys. That's Hansen translation. But Jesus says in Mark chapter 14, verse 6, leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She's done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want. Poverty's not going away. He said, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. And I want you to hear that. She couldn't do everything, But she had done what she could, and actually she gave in her recklessness beyond what she actually understood, because she was preparing Jesus' body for burial by anointing it ahead of time. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare my burial. I tell you the truth, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. So Jesus has said, you got two sheroes of the faith here. You got the nameless widow and you got the nameless wealthy lady. They both did the same thing. They gave recklessly to God. Recklessly. I mean, I know you're supposed to be smart and do the math and get your adding machines out and do this right. Get your spreadsheets and figure it out so that you honor God as good administrators and stewards. I'm good with that, guys. I do that. I got my accounting business degree, okay? But every once in a while, why don't you just give God a free ride? Why don't you just say, hey, God, I know we've been doing this 90-10 thing for a while. How about if this month we just go 50-50? You think you'll die? I rather doubt it. I remember this one couple marched into my office. I told you the story before, so you can go to sleep if you want. And they're on a fixed income, and they were just saying, we've never gotten to this point where we could give a tithe. We were afraid to do it, and so I said, okay, I'll probably get in trouble with the elders, but here's what we're going to do. I want you to tithe for the next 6 months, and I want you to keep very clear records of how well you're doing. And if you are hurt in any way from doing that, come back to me in 6 months, and we'll give you every penny back. I am that sure that if you are reckless in your giving, God will bless you. I'm that sure. They never came back. They're still here. They're still doing fine. I just think that every once in a while we need to be, I remember on the mission field that, we had to be real careful with our money and we had to turn in expense reports. And one of the people on our mission field, he said, I don't turn in an expense report. And I said, well, you mean you just absorb all that? He said, no, I just give God a lot of free rides. He's retired now and he's doing fine. I got to tell you, I don't mean to be morbid and freak anybody out, especially before lunchtime. But if Jesus doesn't come back first, every one of us one day is going to be 6 feet under, pushing up daisies. We're all going to die. And I can assure you to a person, every one of us who dies will wish that while we were in the land of the living that we had been more generous towards the purposes of God and stored up more treasure in heaven. To a person. So my question to you this morning is, why are we holding back now then? What are we so afraid of? There was a little boy that was listening to Jesus one day. He was out in a remote place preaching to thousands of people, and as preachers sometimes do, he went a little long. Like I do sometimes, right? And so this little boy decided, they're all hungry, so I'll just give Andrew, one of Jesus' followers, my lunch, and you take it to Jesus. It's probably no big deal, but it's just a little bit of fish and bread. And they passed it to Jesus, and he told people to sit down, and he began to break the fish and the bread and bless it, and then he began to distribute it, and he fed thousands of people with a little boy's lunch. You don't even know what God can do with your little when you give it to him. Do you know how much 2 small, thin copper coins can buy in heaven when they're everything you had to give on earth? Jesus gives us outlandish promises about giving us rewards when we're faith-oriented stewards on earth, right? About storing up treasures on earth. I mean, they're there in the scriptures. I'm not making this up. Okay, this is what I want God to do. And I don't know if he'll answer this prayer. Because I know this lady died a long time before I did, but she's waiting last judgment. I want to make it to the last judgment before this woman. Because I want to be there to see her reception. Can you imagine this widow showing up, totally unassuming, totally unimpressed with herself, totally enamored with God, and she's clueless that her story's been written for everybody for the last 20 centuries to read in the Bible. So she's showing up to heaven. That's why I want to be there first, because everybody's going to stand up and give this woman a standing ovation as she marches in. She's probably going to go, who are they clapping for? She doesn't know. She doesn't know her story's in the Bible. And if he lets me be there, I'm going to be weeping because this woman embarrasses me. And she exhorts me. And she encourages me to develop more of a generous spirit towards the things of God. And I got to tell you, if there's anybody that's going to hear, well done, it's this Shiro, isn't it? And she doesn't even know. How much can two little tiny thin coins buy in heaven when they are everything that you had on earth to give? Wow. Remember, folks, this whole thing is about developing a generous spirit. And our goal should be, as disciples of Christ, to organize our lives in such a way that we're good stewards of the resources that flow through our lives. Organizing our lives in such a way so that we don't spend them, but God can spend them. Because that's what it means to be a servant of God, an administrator of God, a manager of God's resources. I want to read this verse one last time, and then we're going to lunch, okay? Luke, I'm not taking you to lunch, but you're going to go. Okay, you can take me to lunch, okay. All right, there you go, all right. Luke chapter 6, verse 38. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For the measure you use will be measured to you. Our Father, this morning, as we do what we do every church service, we call our ushers forward to receive our morning tithes and offerings. My prayer is not that we just have a big offering this morning, God. It's so much bigger than that. My prayer is that you would birth generous spirits in your people here at Creekside Christian Church. And that we live with an open heart, an open wallet, open hands, open homes, open lives, believing that you will be more than generous to meet the needs of our families. So God, would you receive these gifts, take them that little boy's lunch, feed multitudes with them, do great things with them. God, would you bless the ripple effect of Creekside Christian Church around the world as we learn to lean into you as a generous God by becoming generous people. We love you this morning. We give to you this morning. We sing praises to you this morning. And we step back with mouths agape because you continue to be recklessly generous to us day after day after day. And we adore you and praise you for that. And all God's people said, amen. Amen.